nice little trip back home to Texas. Before I went back to Texas, I went to Iowa and hung out with a bunch of libertarians there for the Iowa State Convention, which was awesome. And then headed back to Texas and did a little bit of campaigning. And then I decided I need another vacation, so I'm back here in Mexico. A couple awesome things I'm going to talk about in just a minute here, so stay tuned. I'm going to talk about some IP, and I'm going to talk about, what was that other thing I was going to talk about? I don't know. Something else I'll remember on top of IP. But then also, before I get started on that, so my wife just said to me, she's getting off work early on Thursday. Do I want to go to the beach? Because it's better to go during the week than the weekends, because that's when all the tourists go. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of weird, isn't it? Like, we are habitual creatures, right? Like, anytime they try to, like, say, like, oh, addiction this, addiction that, that's a habit. That's really all it is. And all of our habits are, of course, chemically... Oh, shit, let me get around this fucking truck with this fucking spikes sticking out of his tires. Like that. What was that little cartoon with the guy with, the spikes sticking out of his tires? Anyways, sorry, someone just tried calling me. I thought they weren't calling until later. But let me finish this. So, yeah, we're all habitual creatures, right? So everything we do is habit. Addiction is habit. All of our habits are chemically based because our entire brain is chemically based. What gives us pleasure? What do we feel the need to do? Oh, let's do that thing that's a habit. And yes, an addiction to a chemical substance, of course, is a direct chemical alteration of your brain. So, of course, that can have a stronger hold on a pattern, on a habit, but it's still a habit. And so, people go on vacation to break the habit of working so hard, right? Work. Oh man, we've been working so hard, I need a vacation. Then they get on vacation, and what do? They still do their habits, which is work during the week and party on the weekend. Now, of course, they're not at work, so they're not really working. Really, they're just enjoying not working, which is relaxing, being lazy, being a bum, laying on the beach. Maybe they'll do some, like, exciting things, like going hiking, something like that, which kind of is work. But then all the partying stuff happens on the weekends. Like, all the bars and nightclubs and everything else are open during the weeks, but it's the weekends where everybody continues to do that because it's a habit. A habit just like they have before they left home. Now, of course, that's not everybody. Not everybody has the same habit. I don't want to say... No, that was... I don't even want to... That was just totally misspeaking. Nowhere near most. A lot of people don't even work Monday through Friday. They have different schedules. Some of them work 7 days a week, hopefully for a few hours. Some of them do like Tuesday through Sunday, something like that. So not everybody's Monday through Friday, and therefore, of course, obviously they have different schedules than that. And it's not like the bars and nightclubs and everything are completely empty, and the beaches during the week, but they are a lot more crowded on the weekends because everyone's playing the same habit. And I know part of that has to do with, the time you get off of work. Like, some people say, oh, I'm just going to take a 3-day vacation, Friday through Sunday, and, so then, of course, when they're down here. That's the only thing. But it's still pretty interesting. Anyways, intellectual property, because I made a post the other day that stirred up some controversy about intellectual property and what it is and what it isn't. And, of course, as usual, I made a post about one particular topic, and everybody took it in a totally different direction. I guess I was being too vague. Guilty of vague booking. But basically, I started talking about intellectual property, and a lot of interesting ideas came up. But usually when we think about intellectual property, and this is one of the reasons that the topic kept going off on tangents, is you hear intellectual property and you think copyrights, trademarks, blah, 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 blah. Copyrights and trademarks are not intellectual property. They are protections of intellectual property. And I think this is a really important distinction, because nobody really knows what intellectual property is. Now, I might have a different definition than everybody else, but what I see it as is any property that is not tangible. And so a lot of people say, like, oh yeah, a logo is not property, or a photograph is not property, or an idea is not property. But I think it is. And the fact that something like an idea, for example, can be copied 1 billion times without, you can't stop it, right? Like, if I tell you 1 + 1 is 2, and you're like, hey, that's an idea, and you go tell it to somebody else, once I've given it to you, I can't stop that. However, if somebody doesn't have that idea, and they go to you and they're like, hey, I know you know some amazing things. I know you know this thing called math. Can you teach it to me? You might say, yeah, if you pay me. Or if you, do something for me. And then it's like, okay, so they're attempting to acquire information, knowledge. It's something they don't have that they're soon going to have. And that is property. It's not tangible. It's not something they can hold. It's not something that can be taken away from them, short of through brain damage or something. But it's property. Now, it's not. I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? I said that already. You can't hold it. It's not tangible. And a lot of people think that's kind of what property is. It's something you can hold and you can defend. And I think the idea of intellectual property is, even though it has the word property in it, it's still a completely different concept. It's something that you can have that's yours. And some property can be taken away, some property can't. Some people say your property is only your property if you can defend it from being taken away from somebody else. And of course, there's always a big enough army somewhere that can always take your property away. So then we don't own it. We don't own anything, and property technically doesn't exist. That argument can be made. But yeah. So I was also thinking, Bitcoin is technically intellectual property, right? It's all derived from a private key, which is your wallet. And if you have that private key, that's property. Now, you can think of it as like, you put it in a dry storage, or what do they call it? Cold storage, whatever. Hardware key, and you lock it up somewhere, and that hardware key becomes the property, but that's just a USB stick with a number on it. The number is really the property, and the number is just an idea. And somebody might be able to write down some random numbers and come up with that same number, even though the chances are extremely unlikely. But that's it. You can copy that number and give it to somebody else, and now there are 2 people with that number. Why you would do that, I don't know. Maybe it's a business partner, maybe it's a marriage, something like that, and both people say, hey, we're going to share this. The same as having a joint bank account, right? Both people have keys to the account. Maybe that's something you do. But even though that number can be copied 1 billion times over and anyone can have access to that wallet, nobody copies it because they want to protect that. Same thing with movies, right? A movie is it's just an idea. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros on a DVD, right? And so if if you have a copy of that and you want to copy it, well, of course you can copy it. Now, if the creators of the movie really wanted to make sure that nobody had a copy of it, they could say, we're not going to give out copies, right? We could say, we're only gonna air it we're only gonna show it in the movie theaters, and that's it. And, of course, people sneak in cameras, but you do whatever you can to stop that. And you prevent people from copying it. Because it's just an idea. Which is so stupid to me, because, like, the movie companies literally hand you a copy, and then they're like, yeah, but don't make any more copies. Now, this is interesting, too, because somebody brought up the question of a table, right? If somebody makes a table for you, like a carpenter, they make a table for you, that table is property. Right? And that's interesting, because if you go to a carpenter and you say, I want a table, well, are you paying him for the property to make the table, or are you paying him for the service to make you a table? You're kind of paying for both, right? Now, he might already have some tables that are already made, in which case, yeah, you're just paying for that, but you're also paying, because, think about it. You've got two carpenters. Which one are you going to hire? Probably the one who actually knows how to make a table, right? The other one might not know how to make a table. You might not know that. You might hire him and you might find out the hard way. But he has intellectual property. He has knowledge. He has information that the other carpenter does not have. And so when you hire one of the two carpenters and one of them says, yeah, I'll bid you a table for $5, he probably doesn't have a lot of intellectual property, or at least not property that he values. Whereas the other guy might say, I'll build you a table for $1,000. Oh, wow, it's a lot more expensive. Hopefully that means he knows what he's doing, because it's not a guarantee that he knows what he's doing, right? But so I think that's interesting, because you're not just paying for the table, you're paying for somewhat of the intellectual property. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Because, you could say, well, a table's not intellectual property, because intellectual property you can just copy. Well, you can copy a table, right? Somebody makes a table, you can copy the design of that table. But if you copy the table by looking at it and saying, hey, I can recreate that, it's probably not going to be the same. It might look the same. It might look very similar. Maybe it's not as strong, because maybe the person who copied it didn't understand things like how the joints were put together. Didn't know that he was supposed to put glue somewhere or a nail somewhere. So even though he might have recreated or reverse engineered the design, he still hasn't copied the entire intellectual property. Or maybe it's, like the idea of a copy of a copy of a copy, where things get lost in between. But now, if the original carpenter had a schematic, a design of every single wood piece, and instructions on how to assemble it, kind of like what IKEA does, then what you could argue is you could copy those instructions, and you'd be able to make an identical table without ever having had the original table, because you know how to make it. You know the idea behind it. And of course, those instructions, like, even if it's on paper and the paper is tangible, they don't have to be on paper. They can be spoken, from, you might have a carpenter who's like, teaches it from generation to generation. It could be spoken, it could be through demonstration. It could be on a USB stick where it's just ones and zeros. There's so many different ways to convey that information. But at the end of the day, it's just information, right? It's not, the plans are not the paper. The plans are not the USB stick. The plans are not the carpenter. The plans are the knowledge. And so that's the intellectual property. And so, yeah, again, it's intellectual property is completely different from other property, because, and that's why you call it intellectual property, not just property. Once you obtain it, you can't always get rid of it. And this is interesting too, because let's say there's a big corporation. They do this with tech corporations, right? You get a job at a tech corporation and they tell you, you're not allowed, we have intellectual property, you're not allowed to spill the beans. You're not allowed to take this intellectual property outside of the company. You're not allowed to tell people how we're doing what we do. You're not allowed to share our secrets. Right? It's called a non-disclosure agreement, usually. And one of the things that's interesting about that is they usually have a no-compete clause, which is like, okay, so let's say you're working for a company and you're programming, right? You're going to learn things there while you're programming. You're going to learn how things are done. And when you leave that job, you can't just erase that information from your brain. So you're going to remember a lot of it. Now, you might be working at one company and then like, hey, you know what? This company sucks. I'm going to go work somewhere else. And maybe their competitor says, hey, we want you to work for us. We'll give you more. We'll give you more than what they're giving you. Well, the non-compete clause basically says you can't do that. You can't work for one of our competitors. But it's usually limited to like a certain number of years, right? Like you can't work for our competitor for 5 years after you quit. And the reason for that is they know you have that property in your head and they can't take it back. They can't take that information out of your head. And with tech companies, probably in 5 years, that information is irrelevant anyways. So, but I think that's really interesting. Now, a lot of, especially libertarians, are upset with IP law because they're like, yeah, you know, all these bullshit IP laws are in place. They protect corporations, they protect like big pharma and their patents, and they prevent people from getting access to medication and all this other stuff, and yeah. But again, that's where we have to draw that differentiation, right? Intellectual property is property, and intellectual property laws are property protection laws, right? And we have the same problems with real property, right? You have property, you live on it, it's yours, okay, fine. Nobody can take it from you. If somebody takes your car, you call the police. I know, libertarians don't call the police, but yeah, they'd call the police. Somebody takes your car, you call the police, right? Somebody took your property, your rights have been violated. Now, there's a law, even with real property, that the government can say, hey, we want your property. Oh, that land? That's ours. We need it for something. We're going to build a parking lot. It's necessary for society. Therefore, your property is now ours. Here's $5. That's what they do. It's not right. It's not moral. It's not ethical. In some cases, arguably it is. But in most cases, it's just a complete abuse of power. But it happens, and it's legal. Intellectual property laws are the same. There's property. Sometimes that property can be validly protected, right? Buying a copy of a movie and then making a copy for your friend, even though it's illegal and there's a big moral dispute on whether or not it's right, is completely different from breaking into somebody's house and stealing their home movies. Right? Isn't that completely different? And so it's intellectual property either way, but how are the rules applied to it? And this is one thing that we always see with how laws are written, right? Usually somebody's like, hey, everybody's copying my DVDs. We need special laws in place to protect Hollywood. And so, you know, a bunch of people with a lot of money, they start lobbying, Congress passes a law, and now they're protected. Of course, in their case, they're protected by us subsidizing the government to go after and arrest people for taking their property instead of them being responsible for securing their own property, which sucks for us because that's not what taxes are supposed to be used for. But anyway, that's another story. But these laws are very specific and arbitrary because of that. And the discussion is never had about, well, what is intellectual property? How much of it should be protected? Where do we draw the line? We never have that conversation. Instead, you have Hollywood saying, yeah, anyone who copies our DVDs, that's hurting our profits, pass a law. And enforce it, throw them in jail. And that's the end of it. They write the law, they pass it, and that's the end of it. Nobody ever has a discussion about it. And you can look at that and say, well, hey, that's wrong, that's immoral, that's crossing the line, that's going too far. That is what happens. Alright, guys, I know I said I was going to talk about something else, but I totally forgot what it was. So, and I got where I'm going. So, eminent domain should be abolished, absolutely. So look, and light skin muffa USA. Oh, essay. He says, I agree with you. We have to protect IP. Like, again, that's an extremely broad statement, because some IP needs to be protected in some public domain. If IP is in the public domain, it doesn't really need to be protected, right? So that's an example. So, like, it's a very nuanced subject, and I think a lot of people just like to hear a couple things and they use a couple examples, and then they're like, okay, well, that's it, end of discussion. And you know, again, this is how all of our laws are passed, and we really need to take more consideration when we're passing laws, or I think we're beyond the point of any laws that need to be passed. We're just in the repeal-only zone. But, you know, and of course, like, people say, well, yeah, laws are government, but it's like, laws are government, which sort of makes them completely illegitimate, but at the same point, they're the results of discussions that we should be having on the society that we live in, and how we should decide to govern ourselves. I mean, that's kind of the reality of it. And, you know, the government's in place because people don't know how to govern themselves. And so, well, you don't know how to govern yourself, or at least not according to my rules, so I'm going to govern you for you. Because there is no agreement on how we should govern each other. And okay, fine, that's how it is. We need to move past that. We need to grow past that. But we're never going to grow past that if we can't start having the discussions so that we can all agree on how we are going to govern ourselves. One other thing I want to throw out on that is just that, you know, a jury, right? A jury is, or a trial is supposed to be the best, most fair, most practical way for two people having a dispute to bring all of their arguments forward, have a discussion, and figure out what the reality is, what the truth is. And of course, that's been turned into, like, can we or can we not use the force of the state to make some shit happen? But that's unfortunately what it's turned into. That's not supposed to be the purpose of that or the trial. It's supposed to determine if somebody is guilty of a crime or not, really. But what's interesting is we see these same discussions going on, and, you know, people pick one side, one argument, and they anchor onto that, they latch onto that, and they won't let it go. And the reality is, like, there's so many more arguments, and if you want to have a discussion about anything like COVID, should we or should we not wear masks, you need to have a trial, you need to have a jury and a decision and a vote and, like, all of this stuff. But we don't do that. We hear, like, oh, we have to wear masks because XYZ, and we just run around telling everybody, have to wear masks, have to wear masks. And somebody else is, oh, we don't have to wear masks because ABC, and they just run around telling everybody, take off the mask, take off the mask. And the reality is, like, those are one-sided conversations, and coming together to have both sides of those conversations and weighing out the pros and cons, and then saying, okay, look, there is no absolute truth to this. Everyone needs to make their own decisions based on certain circumstances. That's ultimately what the conclusion would be. But that's not where we go. We end up turning it into a fight because we think it's all black and white. So same thing. I know I'm going off on a tangent from intellectual property, which is what I accused everybody else of doing on my post originally. But you know, that's the thing. There are nuances. Not everything's black and white. Bitcoin pimp, Thanks for the request, but I'm just about to end this thing. I'm like, I know. I started trying to end this like 10 minutes ago, and I'm still going. But I gotta run. But we'll do another one sometime. I should have you on the show sometime again. Anyways, I'll catch you guys later. Taxation is theft.